12 reasons why you whiff in Rainbow Six Siege. No matter how long you've been playing or how high of a rank you are, you likely have experienced the feeling of whiffing all of your shots at an opponent that you should have killed. It happens, but the most important thing is to learn from these moments so that you don't make the same mistake again. However, it can be difficult to understand why you whiffed in the heat of the moment. So in today's video, I've compiled 12 of the most common reasons why I see people whiff to hopefully help you improve. If you notice some of the things I mentioned you do often, take note and follow the tips I give you to correct it before it becomes a bad habit. Now, the first reason I see a lot of people whiff their shots in Siege is being too impatient. We've all seen an opponent and then fired our weapon before we had a clear shot. You never want to do this because first of all, it allows the opponent to potentially get away. But second of all, if you get into a gunfight with that person, you're then going to be forced to control recoil in the middle of a flick, which is going to increase the likelihood that you whiff your shots. And it's removing that first shot accuracy that you'd get with normal shots. If you notice yourself being impatient in a lot of games, just make for sure that you wait until you have a clear shot onto your opponent and try not to fire until your crosshair is actually on the opponent. I see it all the time in lower ranks where players will see an opponent pop up on their screen and they'll start shooting before they adjust their crosshair onto the opponent. If you do this, it's going to cause you to lose more gunfights and it's going to cause you to have more embarrassing whiffs. Now, the second common reason I see a lot of players whiff their shots is because they're holding angles too tightly. If you hold an angle too tightly onto a doorway or you don't hone an angle in the proper position, it's going to make it way harder for you to react in time, because unlike what you may believe, you don't have a sub 100 millisecond reaction time. So you need to position yourself in a way when holding an angle that gives you enough time to react and kill the opponent. And another reason why holding an angle too tightly is bad is because it will once again force you to flick onto an opponent, because if an opponent runs past your super tight angle and you're gonna have to flick your crosshair outwards to take that gunfight. Solving this is pretty simple. You typically want to put your crosshair just a few inches ahead of the angle that you're holding, so that way when an enemy walks by or walks in front of the angle, then by the time you're pulling the trigger, the enemy will be at your crosshair. Whereas if you were to hold an angle right up against the door frame, when the enemy runs out, you're gonna have to flick to them by the time you react. Now, the third reason I see a lot of people whiffing their shots in Siege is wide swinging too often. Basically, what a wide swing is when you swing a doorway and basically guess where the enemy is going to be, and you swing it wide so you're not checking other angles in the room. This will leave you extremely vulnerable, and if the enemy isn't where you're looking, you have to flick to a different part of the room to be able to take that gunfight, which I'm sure, as you've gathered, flicking in Siege is not ideal. You don't want to be relying on your ability to flick in Siege. You want to put yourself in gunfights where your crosshair is almost always on the opponent, because it's going to give you an advantage in the gunfight. So instead of wide swinging, you want to peek each angle one at a time so that you aren't caught off guard by any opponent that's in the room. You can do this by Shiko peeking slowly through a doorway, or you can do this by just simply slowly peeking the doorway and checking each individual angle before you swing deeper. This will allow you, if you see an opponent, to immediately shoot while your crosshair is in their general area, instead of having to flick onto them because you guessed the wrong part of the room. Now, speaking of which, the fourth reason why a lot of people whiff their shots in Siege is taking gunfights without info. This forces you to guess or rely on sound alone to figure out where the opponent is in a room. And if you're wrong, you'll likely end up having to flick onto the opponent, which, as I mentioned with wide swinging, is a huge issue. So before you take any gunfights or before you try to take any map control, you want to be using your drones, using any cameras on the defense that you have at your disposal, or information that your teammates can provide to you to hopefully give you an advantage and to help you avoid this. If you can get info on the general position of your opponent before you have to walk into them, it will help you pre-aim that position and it will stop you from being caught off guard. But in Siege, taking gunfights without info is basically inevitable because you can't have drones, cameras, or traps in every position on the map. And in those situations, the other tips in this video will apply. But you should generally try to avoid that at all costs if possible. Now, the fifth reason why a lot of people whiff their shots is not aiming head level. The reason this is so important is because in Siege, there's a one-shot headshot mechanic, which means that if you're not aiming at head level, you're missing out on that satisfying headshot and you're going to lengthen the gunfight, which puts more reliance on your gun stats to win the gunfight. This is especially important when you're using guns that don't have a super good damage output like Valkyrie's MPX, because if you try to go for body shots, most likely the attacker's weapon is going to end up besting you in that fight. And also, if your crosshair placement is off and it's not on head level, then it's going to force you to flick onto the opponent like I mentioned before. What you can do to get rid of this habit is to go into the shooting range with these settings, so that way you can practice the different head levels at different ranges as well, so that way you can get used to aiming at those heights. And then you can also use barricades in custom games to practice where the head level is, because just around the second belt buckle at the top of a barricade is where head level is. So if you just aim at that buckle and then walk around a map in custom game, it'll allow you to get better at crosshair placement around the map. You can also use training drills to practice this as well, since it puts dummies around actual ranked maps, which will help you get better at not only aiming head level, but practicing other things I've mentioned in this video, like peeking angles one by one and getting impatient. So just try to use all of these training resources to your disposal, because trust me, having bad crosshair placement is a terrible habit that you need to fix as soon as possible. Crouching too often in fights can also cause you to whiff a lot of your gunfights. This is something even I do often, and it's a problem that I've been trying to fix over the past few months. The reason this is such an issue is because it changes the position of your crosshair, which is going to make it harder for you to hit headshots and potentially harder to just hit an opponent in general. It also obviously lowers your head, potentially giving an enemy a free headshot if they're aiming at your chest level. So you want to avoid doing that as much as possible. And the way I recommend training yourself out of this habit is to go into arcade and play arcade without crouching the entire time. Actively be thinking in your head throughout the match, don't crouch. And as long as you continue to practice that and can continue to play arcade, you'll eventually be able to break that muscle memory habit of crouch spamming in a gunfight. If you've been playing Siege for a while, or if you've been playing games like Counter-Strike or Valorant where crouching is a huge component in a gunfight, then it's going to be a lot harder for you to get rid of this habit than it is for someone who's brand new to the game. But trust me, if you put in the hours in arcade or even in quick match and other modes in the game, you'll eventually be able to break the habit, which will give you a huge advantage in gunfights. I'm not saying you can't crouch in a gunfight, just try to avoid doing it super often, because it will most likely end up causing you more harm than good. Speaking of crouch spamming, another very common bad habit that players form that ends up causing them to whiff a lot is lean spamming. This specifically I saw a lot on console when I used to play, and it's extremely bad for your aim's consistency because it flicks your crosshair back and forth, allowing you to easily miss your shots. And especially since when you're lean spamming, it causes your crosshair to go over the head of an opponent. It makes your aim even worse if you have good crosshair placement and you're good at hitting headshots. The way to get rid of this habit is very similar to the way you'd get rid of a crouch spamming habit, and that is to just go into arcade, go into quick match, and constantly think about not leaning in your gunfights. If you're actively thinking in your head, don't lean when you're taking a gunfight, eventually you won't have to think about it anymore and it'll just become habit. If you're someone that has built up a habit of lean spamming over multiple years of your gameplay, then it's going to take a lot longer to get rid of this habit than it would be for someone who's just started playing the game. So trust me, the sooner you can get rid of this habit, the better, because it will help you win more gunfights and cause you to stop whiffing as much. Another habit that is devastating for your aim and that can cause you to whiff a ton is sprinting too often. The reason sprinting is such a problem is because it forces your gun down, which means that if you have to get into a gunfight, you have to deal with the slow ADS speeds that Siege has nowadays, which can easily cause you to lose a gunfight before you can ever even get your gun up. And so basically the way to avoid this problem is to just spend way more time in your matches ADS'd, and to also only sprint when you know an area is clear. You only want to be sprinting in Siege when you're rotating from one side of the map to the other that you know you've cleared, or in the last seconds of a round when you have no other choice but to sprint. If you can ADS down a hallway or up a staircase, you should be doing it. Or at the very least, you should be walking instead of sprinting, because it will give you a faster ADS speed if a gunfight does arise. Now, another thing that can cause you to whiff in Siege that most people don't think about is having a bad mindset. Something many players overlook when they play games in general is their mindset. The way you're feeling emotionally before you go into a game can heavily affect the outcome of the match. Letting your KD or other factors emotionally affect you can cause you to make mistakes you otherwise wouldn't. Also, having bad things going on in your life that's causing you to be extremely stressed at the time can also affect your ability to perform, because you're constantly thinking about stuff outside of the match. You want to try to stay calm and realize that at the end of the day, it's just a game. And you want to try to avoid letting things get to you in a match. This is why I tell people all the time to turn off their all chat, so that way they can't see the enemy team talking crap about them, because most people don't handle those situations very well, and it causes them to end up playing worse. The same thing applies for toxic teammates. If you have teammates that are constantly telling you that you're crap, or that you need to start getting more kills or stuff like that in a ranked match, just mute them, because they're not adding anything to the conversation, and they're just going to end up causing you to play worse. Now, something that most new players struggle with that causes them to whiff a lot is having terrible settings. This can include a long range of different problems with settings. For example, a bad aspect ratio can result in enemies being harder to see and shoot. If you have too high of a sensitivity or too low of a sensitivity, it can result in you over flicking or under adjusting. Then if you have screen shake intensity on, it can make it extremely hard for you to hit your shots during an explosion, and really bad crosshair settings can make it hard for you to see in certain environments. So to fix all of these issues, for aspect ratio, I recommend you choose between either either the 4:3 or the 16:9 or 16:10 aspect ratios, because both of them are the most commonly used and they're pretty clean and don't obstruct too much. The 4:3 aspect ratio is better if you want enemies to look bigger on your screen, because since it stretches your screen horizontally, it makes enemies look a lot bigger. But if you want to have a wider field of view and you also want enemies to move slower across your screen, 16:9 or 16:10 is better, because enemies won't move as fast on your screen since they're not as big. Then to fix the screen shake issue, you obviously just have to go into your settings and disable it. That's pretty simple. And then for bad crosshair settings, you typically want to have your opacity be somewhere between the 60 to 100% range, so that way you can actually see the color of your crosshair. And then I recommend you choose between 3 different crosshair colors, those being green, default, and red. The reason these colors are the best is because green and red blends in with the least amount of stuff on a map, which means it's going to be easier for you to see opponents. And also green, red, and default all are bright and dark enough so that way you can see in tons of different environments. Then for the sensitivity issue, that's a little bit more of a difficult subject. Picking a sensitivity in Siege is mostly personal preference, so you're just gonna have to play Siege and feel things out. But the way I recommend you pick a sensitivity is you typically want your sensitivity when you're going across your mouse pad to allow you to do 1.5 360s. This is a rule that I discovered when reading about different game sensitivities, and ever since then I've used that rule to pick my sensitivities on pretty much any setup I use. So just go into the shooting range and mess with your settings until you can do a perfect 360 and a half, and that will probably be good for you. But keep in mind, this is also obviously all personal preference. If you want another way to choose sensitivity, you can also practice in the shooting range flicking between different targets and try to figure out whether you're flicking too far past an opponent or your flicks are stopping before you hit the opponent. If you notice one of those two major issues in your aim, it's likely because your sensitivity is either too high or too low, and you can adjust accordingly. Now, the 11th biggest reason why a lot of people with their shots is because they're just simply not warming up. You are most susceptible to whiffing shots in your first couple of games of the day. Warming up every day in the shooting range / arcade before you go into any matches can help you eliminate this problem immediately, because it will make for sure your aim is on point and ready for the matches ahead. I recommend these settings on the shooting range to warm up because it allows you to practice on super small targets and to practice your flicks between different subjects, which is typically where you want to warm up the most. And then after I warm up in shooting range for a little bit and I practice my flicks, I then like to normally play one arcade match afterwards so I can practice against actual players. If you do those two things, I promise you'll be plenty warmed up for any match that you go into, and I guarantee it will help your aim on the day. Now, the 12th and final reason why you whiff in Siege is likely because you haven't practiced recoil. Not practicing recoil as a new player can be disastrous. It can cause you to whiff shots even if you're doing everything else right. It doesn't matter if you hold an angle perfectly and you're aiming head level and you're clearing angles one by one. If you can't control the recoil of your weapon, you're never going to hit your shots. So you want to be spending time in the shooting range in the first room to figure out the recoil of different weapons that you use often. This can be done simply by just shooting your weapon into the target, figuring out where the bullets are going. If they're going up and to the right, you want to pull down and to the left. If they're going up and to the left, you want to pull down and to the right. And if they're going mostly up the middle of your screen, you just want to pull down and nothing else. This alone will help your recoil control a lot. And the more you spend time with the weapon, the better you'll get at it. You can also, while you're in the shooting range, change your attachments around to see what feels best for your playstyle. If you're especially struggling with recoil, you might want to bring a vertical grip and then some form of barrel attachment to lower the recoil of your weapon. But if you're a player that's pretty much got recoil control down, you can probably get away with not running the vertical grip and running something else. It's kind of up to you to decide and what level of experience you feel like you have. Anyways, that's going to wrap up today's video. Let me know if one of these tips helps you out, or if you have any tips of your own. I'd love to hear them in the comments down below. If you enjoyed today's video, I make these content just like this twice a week, so go subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter if you don't want to miss the next upload. If you want to watch another video just like this one, a video will be popping up on your screen right now that I'm sure you all enjoy. I'll see you next time, friends, and peace.